Jackson Hayes was dying. That wasn't the strange part. Out here, in the Arizona dust of 1867, dying was just a part of the landscape. No, the strange part was the man watching him do it. Blood was seeping through his shirt, a hot, sticky mess painting the dirt a dark crimson. The bullet in his side was a ball of fire, a private little sun burning him from the inside out. He'd been crawling for what felt like an eternity, but was probably just an hour. Stopping meant death. He knew that. But moving hurt so damn much. 3 miles back, two riders had come out of nowhere. Like ghosts made of dust and greed, they took his horse, his rifle, his last canteen of water, and they left him with this hole in his ribs, a parting gift before they rode off, laughing. The sun was dropping, and the desert's cruel trick was coming. The heat bled out of the land, replaced by a cold that could kill a man just as quick. Blood loss, exposure. It was a race to see which would claim him first. His vision swam. The world was a smear of red rock and pale sky. He dragged himself toward a stand of juniper trees, thinking of shelter. And that's when he saw him. A figure tall and impossibly still, silhouetted against the last of the light. Just watching. Jackson's hand went for his pistol, a ghost of a habit. But it was gone, of course, taken with everything else. He tried to shout, but his throat was a dry husk. All that came out was a pathetic rasp. The figure started moving, not fast, but with a purpose that made the hairs on Jackson's neck stand up. Closer and closer, until the features resolved themselves in the twilight. An Apache man, maybe 50 years old. His face was a roadmap of hardship, weathered and creased like old leather. His eyes, they were dark and deep, and they looked at Jackson not with hate, but with a kind of clinical assessment, like a man judging livestock. Jackson had been a soldier. He'd fought men who looked just like this one. He'd killed them. Now he was helpless, bleeding out on their land. He closed his eyes, waiting for the knife, waiting for the justice he'd always known was coming for him. But it didn't come. Instead, the Apache knelt beside him. His hands were surprisingly gentle as they probed the wound. And then he spoke, his English broken but clear. "Bad," he said, "but not death. Not yet." The man's eyes scanned the horizon, a quick, nervous flicker. "Not safe here. Can you walk?" Jackson tried. He pushed himself up, his muscles screaming in protest. The world spun, a violent carousel of rock and sky, and he collapsed back into the dust. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was the Apache man leaning over him. The last thing he felt was the surprising strength in those wiry arms as he was lifted from the ground. He woke up smelling smoke, not the acrid smoke of a battlefield, but the sweet, herbal scent of something burning slowly. A small fire crackled nearby, a comforting sound in the deep stillness of a cave. The fire in his side was still there, but it was a duller ache now, a distant ember instead of a raging inferno. He blinked, his eyes slowly adjusting to the dim light. The Apache man was there, sitting cross-legged by the fire. He was grinding something in a small stone bowl, his movements economical and precise. "3 days," the man said, not even looking up. "Fever was bad. Is better now." Jackson reached for his side. A thick poultice of mashed herbs was packed against the wound, held in place by strips of clean cloth. You saved me," Jackson croaked. The man grunted, a sound that might have been agreement. "I am Tammy." He finally looked up, his eyes meeting Jackson's. He pointed at the bandage. "Bullet passed through. Good fortune." Jackson tried to sit up, a sharp groan escaping his lips. "Why? Why did you help me? You don't know me?" Tammy's gaze was steady, unblinking. "I know enough. You were a soldier." It wasn't a question. Jackson nodded slowly. The old scars, maybe, or the way he carried himself. Some things never washed off. "Yes, but not anymore." "Good," Tammy said, returning to his grinding. "War brings only sorrow." There was something in his voice, a deep well of pain that went far beyond the simple words. Jackson looked closer, and for the first time he saw it. The dark, dried blood stain on Tammy's own shirt, the unnatural pallor beneath his copper skin. "You're hurt too," Jackson said. Tammy waved a dismissive hand. does not matter. Not now. He set the stone bowl aside and stared directly at Jackson, and the intensity in his gaze was like a physical weight. I need something from you, soldier. Name's Jackson. Jackson Hayes. Hayes, Tammy repeated, nodding slowly. I need something. And a promise. What kind of promise? Jackson asked, a knot of unease tightening in his gut. My daughters, Tammy said, his voice cracking just for a second. They hide. Soldiers came to our village. Burned it. Killed many. They hunt the ones who ran. Jackson felt a familiar sickness rise in his throat. He'd been on those hunts. He'd been one of the hunters. How old are they? Nara is 9 summers. Kimmy is 7. For a moment, the warrior's mask slipped, and all Jackson saw was a father. They are all I have left. Your wife? Tammy's face hardened again, the grief turning to stone. Taken. Sickness from the white man's fort. 2 winters ago. He took a ragged breath. I fought the soldiers when they came. I was wounded. The girls ran, just as I taught them. The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture Jackson didn't want to see. You want me to find them? Take them somewhere safe. Tammy nodded. They hide near the dry wash, below the Red Ridge. You know this place? Jackson did. It wasn't far from his own small homestead, a place he'd passed a dozen times. I know it, but why me? Why trust me? I was a soldier. Was, Tammy stressed the word, and now the Creator has put you in my path. You owe a life debt, Hayes. I am asking for payment. The logic was brutal, unbreakable. Whatever Tammy's reasons, whatever spirit had guided his hand, Jackson did owe him his life. I'll find them, Jackson said, the words feeling heavy in his mouth. But what then? Where do I take them? Protect them, Tammy corrected. Keep them safe. That is all. He reached into a small leather pouch at his belt and pulled something out. It was a strip of deer hide, intricately decorated with tiny blue beads. Show them this. They will know it is from me. It will tell them to trust you. Jackson took the beaded strip. It felt warm from Tammy's body. The weight of the promise was real, tangible in his hand. Your wound, Jackson said, gesturing to Tammy's side. Let me help you. Then we can go together. Tammy shook his head, a slow, final movement. Too late for me. He pulled back his shirt, and Jackson's blood ran cold. It wasn't a clean wound like his own. It was a vicious, ragged gash across Tammy's abdomen. The skin around it was angry and red, tinged with a sickly black at the edges. Infection had set in deep. I used the last of my medicine on you, Tammy said, his voice quiet, matter of fact. The air left Jackson's lungs. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. This man, this Apache warrior who should have been his enemy, had used his only healing supplies on him, while his own life was draining away. Why? The word was a whisper. Tammy's eyes bored into him, filled with a father's desperate love. My daughters need a living protector, not a dying father. The practicality of it was like a punch to the gut. It was devastating. Promise me, Hayes, find them. Keep them safe. Looking into that dying man's eyes, what else could he do? Jackson nodded. I promise. A flicker of relief passed over Tammy's face. Good. He reached out, his hand surprisingly strong as it gripped Jackson's forearm. One more thing. If soldiers come, if they ask, they were never here, Jackson finished. I never saw them. For the first time, the faintest ghost of a smile touched Tammy's lips. Perhaps the Creator chose well after all. Tammy was gone before the sun came up. Jackson buried him under a pile of stones just outside the cave. He had no idea about Apache burial rites, so he just said the Lord's Prayer. The only one he remembered from a childhood that felt 1,000 years ago. He hoped some God somewhere was listening. The journey back to his homestead was a special kind of hell. Every step sent a jolt of fire through his side. Without a horse, the miles stretched on forever. When he finally crested the last ridge overlooking his small cabin, the sun was already bleeding across the western sky. He stood there for a long moment, just looking. It wasn't much. A one-room shack he'd built with his own 2 hands, with a lean-to for the handful of goats that were his only company. But it was his, bought with the last of his army pay after he'd left. Left was the polite term. Discharged in disgrace was closer to the truth, even if the papers didn't say so. Captain Miller, his commanding officer, had given him a choice: a court-martial or a quiet resignation. All because Jackson had finally drawn a line. A raid on an Apache camp. Intelligence said it was mostly women and children. Old men, not warriors. "I'm not a coward, Captain," he'd said, standing in Miller's dusty tent. "I'm just not a butcher." Miller had called him a traitor, an Indian lover, said he was spitting on the graves of every soldier who died fighting the Apache. But in the end, the captain hated the idea of a scandal more than he hated one disobedient lieutenant. So Jackson Hayes walked away, with nothing but the bitter taste of ash in his mouth and the knowledge that he'd drawn his line far too late for far too many. And now here he was, a promise to a dead man who should have been his enemy, a promise to find two little girls hiding from men who wore the same uniform he once had. As he got closer to the cabin, he scanned the terrain. The bandits who'd shot him might not have been a random attack. A man alone was a tempting target. But inside, everything was just as he'd left it, untouched. He cleaned and redressed his wound. Tammy's poultice had worked a miracle. The bullet hole was already closing, clean and without infection. He ate some stale cornbread and jerky, then gathered what little he had left: a canteen of water, a bit more jerky, the beaded strip of deer hide. Sleep didn't come easy. It was filled with old ghosts, faces of Apache warriors he'd killed in battle, their eyes turning into Tammy's, asking him a question he couldn't answer. He was up before dawn, the sky a pale, bruised purple. The red ridge glowed like a hot coal in the first light of the sun. He moved carefully, his eyes scanning every rock, every bush, every shadow for a sign of two small children. Nothing. It was as if the earth had swallowed them whole. But he knew better. Apache children were taught to move like whispers, to leave no trace. He reached the dry wash Tammy had described and followed its winding path. He was starting to think it was hopeless, that they were long gone. And then he saw it, a small, smooth stone placed on top of a larger one, an arrangement that was just a little too perfect to be natural. He moved closer. Another sign, a bent twig pointing in a direction that made no sense. He knelt, examining the dust, a small patch, cleared and smoothed, where a child might have sat. They were here, or they had been. "Hello?" he called out softly. His voice sounded loud in the morning stillness. Then he remembered the word Tammy had taught him, a word of thanks, of peace. The silence that answered was absolute, but he felt it, the unmistakable prickle on the back of his neck that told him he was being watched. He crouched down, placing his canteen and the wrapped jerky on a flat rock. He made sure they could see it. Then he backed away slowly and sat on a boulder, waiting. The sun climbed higher, beating down on him. His wound throbbed a steady, painful rhythm. An hour passed. Nothing. Just as he was about to give up, a flicker of movement, a shadow detaching itself from a larger shadow under a mesquite bush. A child, a little girl, so still and silent she seemed like part of the landscape. She was watching him with huge dark eyes. Jackson didn't move a muscle. He reached into his pocket, his movements slow, deliberate. He pulled out the beaded strip of deer hide and held it up, so the morning sun caught the blue of the beads. "Your father," he said, his voice low and calm. "Tammy. He sent me." At the sound of the name, another figure appeared. An older girl, maybe 9. She stepped in front of the younger one, a tiny, fierce protector. They were thin, their clothes torn, their faces streaked with dirt. But their eyes were sharp, intelligent, and filled with a weariness no child should ever know. The older one, Nara, studied him. Her gaze was unnervingly old. She whispered something to her sister, Kimmy, who never took her eyes off Jackson. Jackson set the beaded strip down on the rock next to the food and water. He backed away even further. "Food," he said, pointing. "Water." For a long, tense moment, the girls didn't move. Then Nara whispered to her sister again and crept forward. She moved in a low crouch, ready to bolt at the slightest hint of danger. She snatched the beaded strip, her eyes scanning the pattern. He saw the tension leave her small shoulders. She recognized it. She said something to Kimmy, and the younger girl cautiously approached the rock. Together they gathered the food and water, their movements quick and efficient. They ate like starving animals, but with a strange, careful precision, not a single crumb wasted. When they were done, Nara looked at him. Her eyes were full of questions he couldn't answer. Not with words, anyway. He pointed to himself. Jackson, he pointed to her. Nara, and then to the younger one. Kimmy. Nara's eyes widened, just a fraction. He knew their names. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He pointed back in the direction of his cabin. He made a walking motion with his fingers. Come with me. He patted the ground, then pointed to his cabin again. Safe. The girls looked at each other, a whole conversation passing between them in a single glance. Nara clutched the beaded strip in her fist. Then she shook her head. She pointed down at the dry wash, then made a gesture with her hand. We stay. He understood. They wouldn't come with him. Not yet. He hadn't earned that trust. As he stood to leave, he had to ask. He pointed to the ground, made a sleeping motion, and then pointed up at the sky. Your father. Nara's face was a stone mask, but Kimmy's little lip began to tremble. They understood. He nodded sadly. I'm sorry. He touched his own heart, then pointed to them, trying to convey that he would be back. As he climbed back up the ridge, he risked a single glance over his shoulder. The dry wash was empty. The girls had vanished, as if they had never been there at all. He fell into a routine. Every morning he'd leave food and water on that same flat rock. Sometimes he'd add a small knife or a bit of twine. Once, a blanket he couldn't really spare, but the nights were getting colder. He'd come back in the evening, and the supplies would be gone. In their place, a small gift, a perfectly shaped stone, a hawk's feather, a crude drawing scratched in the dirt of two small figures next to a larger one. He never saw them, but he always felt them watching. He'd catch a flicker of movement out of the corner of his eye, the glint of dark eyes from behind a rock. They were getting stronger, ranging further. He could see their tracks. With every visit, he'd speak a few words. Water, rock, sky, hoping they'd start to understand. He was trying to protect them, just like he promised Tammy. But how could he protect ghosts? What would happen when the first snows came? He was running out of time. Then one bitter cold October night, the answer came to him. A scratching sound at his cabin door. It wasn't the wind, it was deliberate. He grabbed his pistol, his heart pounding in his chest. He crept to the door. Who's there? Silence. Then more scratching. Faint, desperate. He unlatched the door and threw it open, expecting an animal. A coyote, maybe. But it wasn't an animal. It was Kimmy. She was huddled on his doorstep, her small body racked with violent shivers. Standing behind her, holding her up, was Nara. Her face was a mask of fear and defiance. In her eyes, a desperate plea. He stepped back, gesturing them inside. Quickly, it's freezing. They didn't understand the words, but they understood the tone. Nara helped her little sister over the threshold, her eyes darting around the cabin, looking for threats, for escape routes. In the dim light from the dying fire, he could see it. Kimmy's face was flushed, her breathing shallow and ragged. Fever. She's sick, he said, pointing to Kimmy, then touching his own forehead, mimicking heat. I can help. Nara looked at him, her gaze guarded, but desperation had won. She gave a single, sharp nod. He led them to his narrow cot. Nara helped Kimmy lie down, then stood beside her like a tiny sentinel, watching his every move. He stoked the fire, bringing warmth and light back into the small room. Kimmy's forehead was burning hot. He laid a cool, damp cloth across it. She whimpered, her eyes fluttering. Pneumonia, he murmured to himself. Or just a bad cold that could kill a child in this wilderness. He looked at Nara. I need to make medicine, like your father did for me. At the mention of her father, something flickered in Nara's eyes. Grief, anger, but she nodded again. Permission granted. He brewed a tea from willow bark to fight the fever, adding a little of his precious honey to make it drinkable. But Kimmy was too weak to even lift her head. Nara took the cup from his hands. She lifted her sister, speaking soft, comforting words in Apache, and helped her drink. For hours, they kept a silent vigil. Jackson preparing remedies, Nara administering them. Outside, the wind howled, throwing handfuls of snow against the cabin walls. Sometime near dawn, the fever broke. Kimmy's breathing eased. She fell into a deep, natural sleep. Nara, still sitting bolt upright beside the cot, swayed with exhaustion. Jackson got his only other blanket. "Sleep," he said, pointing to the floor beside her sister. "I'll watch." She shook her head, her eyes struggling to stay open. "Trust me," he said softly, "as your father did." Something in his voice must have gotten through. Her small shoulders slumped. She took the blanket and curled up on the floor, her hand still resting on Kimmy's arm. In moments, she was asleep. Jackson sat in his chair, watching the two small girls in the flickering firelight. A weight he hadn't even known he was carrying settled on his chest. Their lives were in his hands now. His, a man who had once been part of the very army that had destroyed their world. "I'll keep you safe," he whispered into the quiet of the cabin. To Tammy's memory, to the girls, to himself. Somehow. The next morning, Kimmy was weak, but the fever was gone. She ate a thin porridge he made, her appetite a good sign. Nara was still watchful, but the sharp, desperate edge was gone. They made no move to leave. Jackson wasn't sure what to do next, so he busied himself with chores, more firewood, patching a drafty wall, checking on his goats, giving them space. When he came back inside, he found Nara holding the beaded strip he'd been given. She looked up at him, a question in her eyes. He sat on the floor near her, respecting the invisible line she still drew between them. He pointed to the beads, then to himself. "Your father gave that to me before he died." Nora studied his face, then said a few words in Apache. She pointed to herself, to Kimmy, and then to him, her gesture taking in the whole cabin. He understood. He nodded. "Yes, you can stay, as long as you need to." The reality of it hit him. Two Apache children living in his home, in a territory where the slightest suspicion could get a man killed. If anyone from the town found out, there would be questions, dangerous questions. But looking at their small, solemn faces, he knew it wasn't a choice. It was a debt to Tammy, and maybe a way to start balancing the scales for all the things he'd done. That night he took out the old tobacco tin where he kept his few treasures, a faded picture of his parents, a letter from his brother, killed at Antietam. He placed the beaded strip inside with them. "For safekeeping," he told Nara, showing her where he put the tin on a high shelf. She watched him, her expression unreadable. Then she reached into a small pouch at her own waist and pulled something out. A tiny bird, carved from a piece of pale wood. It was no bigger than his thumbnail, but the detail was incredible. She held it out to him, a gift. He took it, the small carving warm in his palm. "Thank you," he said. And then, remembering, "Ah-heh-heh-heh." Nara's eyes went wide. For the first time, the corner of her mouth twitched upwards. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. A ghost of a smile, there and gone. "Ah-heh-heh," she repeated, her voice a soft whisper. The first word she had ever spoken directly to him. It was a fragile beginning, a single word in a vast, dangerous wilderness. But as Jackson placed the tiny bird in the tin next to the beaded strip, he felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. The days settled into a strange, cautious rhythm. He worked his homestead. They helped with small chores. They didn't talk much, but they were starting to build a language of their own. Gestures, a few shared words. Kimmy was a sponge, soaking up English. She'd point at something, and he'd name it. Chair, spoon, roof. She'd repeat the word, her pronunciation careful, locking it away. Nara was more reserved. She watched him with those old, serious eyes, as if she was trying to see right through him, to the man he used to be. She was always the protector, always positioning herself between Kimmy and the world, including him. It was Kimmy who finally broke the silence. One night, he was mending a leather harness by the fire. She came and sat right next to him. "What doing?" she asked, her English still halting. "Fixing," he said. showing her how he threaded the rawhide. It's broken. She nodded seriously. Then she held out her small hands. I help. He hesitated for a second, then handed her a piece of rawhide. He showed her how to tie a simple knot. Her small fingers copied his movements perfectly. When the knot held, she looked up at him and gave him a shy, proud smile. Good, he said, smiling back. Very good. From across the room, Nara watched. He couldn't read her expression. But later that night, he noticed she had moved her sleeping pallet. She was no longer placing herself between Kimmy and him, just next to her. It was a small thing, but it was everything. Winter came down on them like a hammer. Storms howled around the small cabin, piling snow up against the door. He taught them how to check his rabbit traps, how to read the clouds for signs of more snow. In the long, dark evenings, he used charcoal to draw pictures on scraps of wood, teaching them to read. Kimmy drank it all in. Nara learned with a grim determination. In return, they taught him Apache words. He was a clumsy student. His attempts at pronunciation made Kimmy giggle, and sometimes he'd even get a rare flicker of a smile from Nara. But the peace was fragile. Twice riders passed by. Once a cavalry patrol, their blue coats stark against the white snow. Jackson hustled the girls down into the root cellar, a dark, cramped space under the floorboards. They stayed there silent as mice until the sound of the horses faded away. After the second time, Nara came to him. Soldiers, she said, her English getting better every day. Look for us. He didn't lie. He couldn't. Maybe, or maybe just passing through. She nodded. They kill our people. It wasn't a question. Yes. You were soldier, she said, her eyes fixed on his face. Before. The old shame twisted in his gut. Yes, before. You kill Apache? Her directness was like a physical blow. He could have softened it, could have lied, but her gaze demanded the truth. Yes, he said quietly, in battle. Never, never women or children. It was the truth, mostly. He'd killed warriors, but he'd also stood by while others. He pushed the thought away. Nara held his gaze for a long moment. Why you help us? It was the question, the one he kept asking himself. Your father saved my life, he said, and it was the right thing to do. She seemed to consider this. Then she gave a single sharp nod. As she turned to walk away, she paused. My father was good man, she said. You try to be good man too. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something close. And coming from this solemn little girl who had lost everything, it felt like more than he deserved. I'm trying, he said softly. I'm trying. Spring finally came, washing the mountains clean. The girls had been with him for 6 months. They had survived the winter. They had become something that wasn't quite a family, but was much more than just 3 people sharing a roof. But with the thaw came a new kind of danger. More travelers, more patrols. They couldn't stay hidden forever. The decision was made for him one bright May morning. He was turning soil in his small garden patch when he heard it. The sharp warning call of a quail. It was Kimmy's signal. Danger. He dropped his hoe and ran. 3 riders were coming up the trail. Not soldiers. Civilians. He recognized one of them. Thomas Burke, the man who ran the general store in the nearest town. The other 2 were strangers. Hard men, with rifles resting easy across their saddles. Jackson wiped his hands on his pants, trying to look casual. Morning, Burke. Burke reined in his horse. Hayes. Been a while. Long winter, Jackson said. One of the strangers, a man with a nasty scar that puckered his cheek, leaned forward. Heard there's been Indian trouble. Seen any Apache up this way? Jackson kept his face a blank mask. Not a soul. Been quiet. The third rider, younger but with eyes as cold as a snake's, looked over the small cabin. Must get lonely out here, all by yourself. There was a greasy insinuation in his voice that made Jackson's skin crawl. The scarred man spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. Army patrol came through town, offering a bounty, $20 a head for any hostile Apache found in these hills. $20, the price of a human life. It made him sick. Well, Jackson said, the lie tasting like poison, if I see anything, I'll be sure to let you know. The young one's eyes lingered on the cabin. Mind if we water our horses at your spring? Every nerve in Jackson's body screamed no. The girls were hidden in the root cellar, right under the floorboards, but to refuse would be suspicious. Help yourself, he said, forcing a casual tone. The men dismounted. As two of them led their horses to the spring behind the cabin, the scarred man wandered around, poking his nose into the goat pen, peering at the woodpile. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Jackson's hand never strayed far from the pistol tucked into his belt. Finally, they mounted up to leave. The young rider paused, fixing Jackson with a hard stare. You sure you haven't seen anyone, Hayes? A man could use that bounty money. I'm sure, Jackson said, meeting his gaze without flinching. He watched them ride away, not relaxing until they were a faint cloud of dust on the horizon. He hurried to the root cellar. It's safe. They're gone. Nara and Kimmy climbed out, their faces pale. They look for Apache, Nara stated. Yes, Jackson confirmed. Kimmy's small hand found her sister's. They kill us if they find. He knelt down in front of them. I won't let that happen. I promised your father. Nara's dark eyes held no illusions. Cannot promise, she said, her voice old and tired. Too many men with guns. She was right. He was one man. Against the army, against men like those, what could he do? That night, a plan that had been slowly forming in his mind finally hardened into a decision. They had to leave. Before summer brought more patrols, more bounty hunters, they would go north, deeper into the mountains, into Colorado territory. Maybe find his cousin Elias. It meant leaving the only home he had, but there was no choice. These children had lost everything. He wouldn't let them lose their lives, too. The next morning, it was Kimmy who found it. She'd been gathering herbs near the spring. She came running back to the cabin, her eyes wide with fear. Jackson, come! She led him to a small clearing. The ground had been disturbed, a shallow pit, hastily dug and refilled. Rocks placed in a crude circle. Bad men, Kimmy whispered, pointing at boot prints in the soft earth. They bury something. A cold dread washed over him. The riders, they had hidden something here when they stopped to water their horses. He used his knife to probe the soft dirt. He didn't have to dig far. A bundle wrapped in a blood-stained blanket. His stomach clenched as he peeled back the cloth. The face of a young Apache warrior stared up at him, his eyes open and lifeless. A single neat bullet hole in the center of his forehead. An execution. Nara had come up silently behind him. She didn't flinch. We know death, she said, her voice flat. Who is he? I don't know, Jackson said. One of your people. Comprehension dawned in Nara's eyes. They kill him for the bounty, and they hide him here. She looked at Jackson. To make trouble for you. The trap was sprung. If the body was found on his land, he'd be blamed, hanged for a murder he didn't commit, or lynched for being an Indian lover. We have to bury him properly, Jackson said, his mind racing. And then we have to go. Tonight. Nara nodded, her decision instant. Yes, not safe here. Not anymore. They gave the young warrior a proper burial, deeper this time, hidden from view. As they worked, Kimmy sang a soft, low chant in Apache, a song for the dead. They packed what little they could carry, food, blankets, his pistol and rifle. Into the old tobacco tin went the beaded strip, the small wooden bird, and a lock of Kimmy's hair she insisted on adding. So we stay together, she said. As darkness fell, Jackson took one last look at the small cabin. He closed the door without locking it. They weren't coming back. They moved north under the cover of a moonless sky, following game trails instead of roads. Jackson in the lead, Nara guarding the rear, Kimmy between them. By dawn, they had put miles between themselves and the trap that had been laid for them. They were fugitives now, a disgraced soldier and two Apache children, running for their lives into the vast, unforgiving wilderness. He had a cousin in Colorado, Elias, a Quaker, a man of peace. They hadn't spoken in years, not since Jackson had taken up a rifle. He didn't know if Elias would help them or turn them away. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. For 3 weeks they walked, mostly at night, hiding during the day. The journey was a blur of exhaustion and fear. Kimmy got sick with a fever, and they had to hide for 3 days in a ravine while she recovered, their meager supplies dwindling. Once a cavalry patrol passed so close he could hear the jingle of their harnesses. He held Kimmy tight, his hand over her mouth, her small body trembling against his chest. They moved on, never knowing how close they'd come. Finally, they crossed into Colorado. The air was cooler, the land greener. They reached the foothills where his cousin Elias had a sawmill. He hid the girls in a thicket. "Wait here," he told them. "If I'm not back by nightfall, go north, follow the river." Nara nodded, her face grim. "We wait until the stars come, then we go." He walked the last mile alone. The sawmill looked the same. A man came out of the nearby cabin, taller than Jackson remembered, with a full beard. But it was him, Elias. Elias saw him, and his body went rigid. "Jackson, is that you?" "It's been a long time, Elias." His cousin didn't smile, didn't move to greet him. 8 years, not since you left to go kill Indians for the government?" The old wound was still raw. "I'm not with the army anymore," Jackson said. "Elias, I need help." "What kind of help?" Jackson took a breath. "I have 2 children with me, girls, Apache girls. They need a safe place." The word hung in the air between them. Apache. Elias's face was a stone mask, but his eyes changed. He gestured toward the cabin. "You'd better come inside, and you'd better start talking." Jackson told him a version of the story, the truth but with pieces left out, the life debt to Tammy, his own dark history. Some things were too complicated. When he was done, Elias was silent for a long time. "You're asking me to break the law, Jackson, to harbor fugitives. I'm asking you to help 2 little girls who have lost everything." Elias stood and paced the small cabin. "If they're found here, I could lose everything. My mill, this land." "I know. I wouldn't ask if there was any other way." Elias stopped pacing and looked at him, his gaze sharp and searching. "These girls, they mean something to you." Jackson thought of Nara's fierce loyalty, of Kimmy's shy smile. "Yes," he said, his voice thick. "They do." His cousin seemed to make a decision. "Bring them here. They can stay. For now." Relief washed over Jackson, so strong his knees felt weak. "Thank you, Elias." As he turned to go, Elias stopped him. "One question. Why? After all you did in the war, why risk everything for 2 Apache children?" Jackson looked his cousin in the eye. The simple truth was the only answer. "Because they needed me," he said. "And I think maybe I needed them too." Elias nodded slowly. "Go get them. It'll be dark soon." Jackson hurried back to the thicket, a fragile hope blooming in his chest. For the first time in weeks, he felt like they might actually make it. But when he reached the hiding place, his blood ran cold. The forest was too quiet. "Nara? Kimmy?" he called out. The thicket was empty. They were gone. Their small packs, their blankets, everything vanished. The only thing left behind was a small object, placed carefully on a flat rock. The tiny carved bird Nara had given him. A twig snapped behind him. Jackson spun, his hand dropping to his pistol. It was Elias. "They're gone," Jackson said, his voice raw with fear and confusion. Elias scanned the ground. "Something spooked them." He pointed. Faint tracks leading away from the thicket. Not north like he'd told them, but east, deeper into the mountains. "I have to find them," Jackson said. "I'll help," Elias said, shouldering his own rifle. "But what if they ran for a reason, Jackson? Are you sure they want to be found?" The question hit him like a punch. Had he been a fool? Were they just using him? No. He remembered Kimmy's small hand in his, Nara's watchful gaze that had slowly softened into trust. Something had scared them away. Something terrible. They tracked them until darkness made it impossible. The trail led steadily east, deeper and higher into the mountains. That night, by a small fire, Jackson found himself telling Elias everything. The whole story, Tammy, the life debt, the promise, his own past. When he finished, Elias looked at him across the flames. "You've changed, Jackson. The brother I knew would never have done this." The brother you knew died in Arizona, Jackson said quietly. They found the girl's tracks again at dawn. By late afternoon, they came to a place where the narrow trail was blocked by a fresh rock slide. They couldn't have crossed this, Jackson said. Or maybe, Elias suggested, they caused it to cover their trail. A voice rang out from the rocks above them, a clear, commanding voice speaking Apache. Jackson looked up, and there was Nara, standing on the path, a small bow drawn, an arrow aimed right at his heart. You bring soldiers, she said, her voice shaking with betrayal. She nodded toward Elias and his rifle. To take us. Understanding hit him like a physical blow. They hadn't run from him. They'd run because they saw a stranger with a gun and assumed the worst. They thought he had betrayed them. No, Nara, he said quickly. This is my cousin, Elias. He's helping me. He's not a soldier. From behind a boulder, Kimmy peered out. You promise safe place? She said, her small voice full of hurt. But man has gun. Many people have guns out here, he explained gently. It doesn't make them soldiers. Nara's bow didn't waver. Why you bring him? We trust you. The words twisted in his gut. He reached slowly into his pocket, pulled out the old tobacco tin, and took out the beaded strip. I always keep my promises, Nara. Something in her stance softened, but the arrow was still aimed at his chest. Then she spoke again, her voice urgent. Girl, she said, pointing down into the valley below. Another girl. Apache, hurt bad, needs help. Jackson looked where she pointed. A thin wisp of smoke curled up from a hidden grove of trees. The girls hadn't been running away from him. They had been running to someone. We can help her, Jackson said. Elias can help. Nara studied his face, her eyes searching for the truth. Finally, she lowered the bow. She is hurt very bad, she said. Maybe die anyway. We'll try, Jackson promised. Show us. The girl in the hidden camp was barely alive. She was maybe 14, beaten and left for dead. Soldiers. They'd attacked a small group of Apache. She was the only one who got away. Her name was Illa. Her face was swollen, an arm was broken, her breathing was shallow. She needs a doctor, Elias said grimly. She won't make it to town. My neighbor, Elias said suddenly. Sarah Cooper. She was a nurse in the war. Her farm is only a few miles from here. I can get her. They built a makeshift stretcher and began the slow, agonizing journey back to the sawmill. Illa was barely conscious. As they prepared to move her, Kimmy pressed the small carved bird back into Jackson's hand. You dropped, she said. Important to remember promise. His promise to Timmy, and now his promise to this new girl, Illa. He tucked the bird away safely. I remember, Kimmy, always. They got Illa back to the cabin just as dusk was falling. Elias rode off to get the nurse and Sarah. Nara and Kimmy worked with a quiet, grim efficiency, cleaning Illa's wounds, making a poultice of herbs. Jackson watched them, amazed. They were children, but they had the competence of adults forged in the fires of tragedy. Elias returned with Sarah Cooper. She was a woman in her 40s with no-nonsense eyes and capable hands. She took one look at Illa and got to work. For an hour she cleaned and stitched and splinted. Finally she sat back. The head injury is the worst, she said. There's swelling. Now it's up to God. As she was leaving, she pulled Jackson and Elias aside. That girl wasn't just beaten, she said, her voice low and furious. Soldiers did this. I saw enough of it during the war to know. Military boots leave certain kind of bruises. The sickness rose in Jackson's throat again. That night, as Nara kept vigil and Kimmy slept, Illa's breathing grew more and more shallow. She is leaving, Nara said, her voice soft. Spirit is going. She began to sing a low melodic chant, a journey song to help the spirit find its way. Kimmy woke and joined in, their two young voices filling the small cabin with an ancient, heartbreaking sorrow. Illa drew one last shuddering breath, and then was still. She is free now, Nara whispered. No more pain. They buried her the next morning on a small rise overlooking the valley. As they filled the grave, Kimmy turned to him. Before she died, she said, Illa tell something. Soldiers. They look for Apache children. to take to school, far away, take from families, never come back. The Indian boarding schools, he'd heard of them, places where they tried to kill the Indian to save the man, erase their culture, their language. That's why they attacked her? Kimmy nodded, looking for children. The danger was worse than he'd ever imagined. They weren't just hunting warriors anymore. They were hunting children. Just then, they heard it, the sound of approaching horses. Army patrol, Elias hissed from the cabin window. 4 of them. The root cellar, Jackson said, his heart hammering against his ribs. He hurried the girls to a hidden trapdoor under a rug. Stay silent, no matter what you hear. They climbed down into the darkness, their faces pale but composed. The patrol leader was a lieutenant with cold, suspicious eyes. He said they were checking for Indian activity. He and his men searched the cabin, their eyes missing nothing. Heard you found a dead Apache girl, the lieutenant said casually, watching their faces. Mountain lion got her. Looks like. A blatant lie. Jackson's blood ran hot, but he kept his face a mask. Then one of the soldiers came back from outside. Lieutenant, tracks, up on that rise. A fresh grave. The lieutenant's eyes narrowed to slits. He drew his pistol. Want to explain that grave, Hayes? The one with Indian burial markers? There was no use denying it. We found a girl, Jackson said. She was injured. We tried to help, but she died. Injured how? The lieutenant pressed. Beaten, Jackson said, his voice hard. By men wearing military boots. The lieutenant's face went white with rage. Search this cabin again. Tear it apart. The soldier came to the rug in the corner. He bent down. He lifted the edge. He saw the iron ring of the trap door. Jackson's hand went to the knife at his belt. It was over. Open it, the lieutenant ordered. The soldier pulled the trap door open, revealing the dark space below, and it was empty. Just potatoes and jars of preserves. No sign of the girls. Jackson stared, his mind reeling. How? Where had they gone? The lieutenant, furious but without proof, finally gave up. I'll be filing a report, he snarled as he left. Expect more questions. As soon as they were gone, Elias rushed to the trap door. Nara, Kimmy, it's safe. A section of the cellar's dirt wall slid aside. It was a false panel. Nara and Kimmy scrambled out of a tiny hidden space behind it. The Underground Railroad, Elias explained. We used it to hide runaway slaves during the war. Nara's face was grim. Soldiers will come back. Not safe here. She was right. They had to run. Again. That night, they set out for an old trapper's cabin Elias knew of, deep in the mountains. He gave Jackson a small worn Bible. It was our mother's, he said. She'd want you to have it. They traveled under a moonless sky, Jackson leading a mule packed with supplies. After a few hours, Nara came to him, her voice a whisper. Someone follows. One person. Far behind. A bounty hunter? Who else would follow them alone? They tried to lose him, scrambling up a steep rocky slope. By dawn, they were nearing the landmark Elias had told them about, a massive split rock. Nara's voice was urgent. He is closer now. They had to make a stand. He couldn't lead this shadow to their new hiding place. I'll set an ambush, Jackson said. Nara, you take Kimmy and the mule. Go. I stay, she said, her small jaw set. I can shoot from the trees. She was a good shot with her bow. It was a risk, but it was a better plan. He sent Kimmy ahead with the mule. Nara climbed a tall pine like a squirrel, disappearing into the high branches. Jackson hid behind a boulder, rifle ready. Minutes later, a figure appeared on the trail, moving cautiously. As the person passed between the boulders, Jackson stepped out. That's far enough, he said, leveling his rifle. The figure froze, then pushed back a wide-brimmed hat. It wasn't a man. It was Sarah Cooper, the nurse. I'm not here to hurt you, Mr. Hayes, she said, her voice calm. I've come to help. She explained that the soldiers had visited her farm, asking questions. She knew they'd have to run, and she'd followed them, wanting to help. From the tree above, Nara's voice floated down. She tells truth. Her heart is good. Sarah had a story of her own. Her sister had married a Cherokee man. Soldiers had killed him and taken their children to one of the boarding schools. She never saw them again. I couldn't help my sister's children, she said, her voice thick with old grief. Maybe I can help these. Together, the four of them found the hidden cabin. It was small, but it was solid. A sanctuary, but their peace didn't last. A few weeks later, Sarah went to the nearest town for supplies and information. She was supposed to be gone 2 days. On the second day, Jackson was scouting the trail, looking for her. Instead, he found soldiers, 3 of them, with a tracker. They were talking about an old woman in town, asking too many questions. Sarah. He raced back to the cabin. They had to run. Just as they were packing, Sarah burst through the door, breathless and terrified. "They're coming!" she gasped. She'd been followed. The local lieutenant was suspicious, and she had something else. A piece of paper she'd torn from a post in town. A wanted poster, crude drawings of him and 2 Apache children. A reward for their capture, dead or alive. "They'll never stop looking for us," Nara said, her voice a dead whisper. "Then we can never stop running," Jackson replied. They fled into the night, heading for a high pass that led to an even more remote valley. Behind them, they could see the flicker of torches as the soldiers found their cabin. The climb was brutal. Sarah, exhausted from her journey, was slowing them down. As the soldiers got closer, she made a decision. "Go," she said, taking Jackson's pistol. "I'll delay them. I can't keep up, but I can buy you time." He didn't want to leave her, but he had no choice. The girl's safety came first. "Take this," he said, pressing his mother's Bible into her hands. "Keep it safe for me." It was a promise that he would see her again. He and the girls scrambled for the pass. Behind them, they heard gunshots. Sarah making good on her word. They made it across the pass just as dawn was breaking. They were in a new valley, wild and unknown. They were alone, and their supplies were almost gone. A storm rolled in, a monster of a storm that trapped them in a shallow cave for 3 days. When it finally broke, the world was covered in a light dusting of snow. Winter was coming, and they were not ready. They were desperate. They needed tools, shelter, food. They followed the river upstream, hoping to find an old abandoned trapper's cabin. Instead, they found smoke, a thin wisp from a well-tended cabin by a small lake. Someone was living there. It was a huge risk, but they were out of options. Jackson approached the cabin alone. An old man came out, a rifle in his hands. His name was Henry Blackwood, a mountain man with a long white beard and eyes that had seen everything. And then he spoke a few words in Apache. He had lived with the Chiricahua for 20 years. He'd had an Apache wife. He took them in. He gave them food. And then he made them an offer. He had another cabin, a hunting camp 10 miles away, unused. They could live there for the winter. In return, they would help him hunt. It was a miracle, a shelter, an ally. A few weeks later, Blackwood came to visit. He brought news. The army had pulled back for the winter. The snows were too deep in the passes. They had a reprieve until spring, and Sarah, she was alive. The army had arrested her, but had to let her go. She was being watched, but she was safe, alias too. But the good news came with a warning, a dark rumor. In the spring, the army had new orders to round up all Indian children, no exceptions, to take them to the boarding schools. A final solution, they were calling it, an attempt to wipe out their culture forever. The choice was clear. Come spring, they had to run again, south, to Mexico, to the Sierra Madre Mountains, where some Apache bands still lived free. It was their only hope. The winter passed in a blur of hard work and quiet preparation. They hunted, they learned, they grew stronger. They became a family, this strange pack of 4, the former soldier, the mountain man, and the 2 Apache children he'd sworn to protect. The snows began to melt. The days grew longer. It was time. One morning, just as they were making their final preparations for the long journey south, Blackwood came running towards the cabin, his face grim. "Soldiers," he gasped. "A whole platoon. They're sweeping the valley. Someone must have talked." They had been found. There was no time to run. They were trapped. Jackson grabbed his rifle. "Nara, Kimmy, get to the root cellar." "No," Nara said. She held up the pistol he'd been teaching her to use. Her hands were steady. "This time, we fight." Jackson looked at this fierce 9-year-old girl and at her sister standing beside her and at the old mountain man loading his rifle. This was his family, and he would not let them be taken. The first shots echoed through the valley. The siege had begun. They were outgunned, outnumbered, but they were not broken. They would make their stand here, in this small cabin, in this forgotten corner of the mountains. The battle raged for what felt like an eternity. Bullets splintered the log walls. The soldiers kept advancing, a relentless blue wave. Jackson, Blackwood, and Nara fired back, their shots precise, making every bullet count. Kimmy reloaded their weapons, her small hands moving with a speed born of desperation. They fought with the fury of people with nothing left to lose. They fought for their home. They fought for their family. And then, just as their ammunition was running low, just as the soldiers were preparing for a final charge, a new sound cut through the chaos. A bugle call. Not an attack, but a retreat. The soldiers were pulling back. Confused, Jackson peered through a crack in the wall. A lone rider was approaching the platoon leader, handing him a dispatch. The soldiers formed up and marched away, leaving the silent, snow-dusted valley behind. They had won. But why? Hours later, another rider approached the cabin. This one was alone. It was Elias. He dismounted, his face etched with exhaustion and relief. "It's over, Jackson," he said. He explained what had happened. Sarah, unable to leave the territory but unwilling to stand by, had used her Quaker connections. She had sent word to influential politicians back east, men who were already questioning the Army's brutal tactics. She told them about the illegal bounty hunting, about Illa, about the Army's plan to forcibly remove all children. Public opinion was turning. The story had caused a scandal. The lieutenant who had pursued them, Captain Miller's protege, had been recalled. The orders for the spring roundup had been rescinded, for now. "It's not a permanent solution," Elias said, "but it's a victory. Sarah bought you time. A lot of it." He handed Jackson a letter. It was from Sarah. Her handwriting was neat, her words simple. "I kept my promise. Now you keep yours. Live well, live free." Tucked inside was his mother's Bible. Jackson looked out at the valley, now peaceful in the afternoon sun. He looked at Nara and Kimmy, their faces smudged with gunpowder, but shining with a fierce, triumphant light. He looked at Blackwood, leaning on his rifle, a rare smile on his face. They had a home. They had a future. They were free. The journey wasn't over. There would be other battles, other dangers. The world hadn't changed overnight, but they had a chance, and they had each other. Jackson Hayes, the disgraced soldier, had found his redemption. Not in a blaze of glory, but in a quiet promise made to a dying man. A promise to protect two little girls. A promise that had led him to this place, to this unlikely family. A promise he would keep for the rest of his days. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of survival and justice from the forgotten pages of history, do me a favor. Hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed. You never know what we'll uncover next.